Something I noticed on a rewatch a while back, and I haven't been able to unnotice it since. Palpatine spends most of 3 films sitting down. Everyone else in Star Wars is running, flying, falling off things, having limbs removed at deeply inconvenient moments. He sits in a chair, he talks, and by the end of it he owns the galaxy. So that's what we're doing. Not the plot, not a scene by scene, and definitely not a ranking of anything. Just one man's worldview, taken seriously, for as long as it takes. Because the odd thing about him, and the reason I wanted to do this at all, is that he tells everyone, constantly, in public. He explains his position to the Senate, to the Jedi, to Anakin, to anyone who'll sit still. And it works anyway. That's the part I find genuinely strange, and it's why he's worth a couple of hours rather than a hot take. We'll go through where he came from, what the Sith actually believe, how he took a republic apart legally, what he was really after, and where the whole thing falls over. If you'd like to subscribe while you're getting comfortable, that's lovely of you. Otherwise, settle in. Let's start with the name, because the name is ridiculous and I refuse to pretend otherwise. For about 30 odd years, the most feared man in science fiction didn't have a first name. He was the Emperor. Then he was Senator Palpatine, then Chancellor Palpatine, then Darth Sidious, and at several points in 6 films, people also call him Emperor and Supreme Chancellor. The original trilogy never even gives you the surname on screen. That comes from the novelization of Return of the Jedi, which is where a lot of early Star Wars detail got quietly filed away. Then in 2014, a canon novel called Tarkin came out, written by James Luceno, and dropped the first name into the world like a stone into a pond. Sheev Palpatine. I remember the reaction to that, and it was not reverent. People had spent decades imagining something suitably grand, something with weight to it, and what they got sounded like a man who runs a garden centre. The best part is that it wasn't some novelist's invention. The name traces back to Lucas himself, which means that somewhere in a notebook for years, the architect of galactic tyranny was called Sheev, and nobody thought to ask. I've come round to it actually. It's the right kind of ordinary. Nobody names their baby Darth Sidious. Somebody's parents on a green, pretty, mid-sized planet named a boy Sheev and presumably had hopes for him. And that's the first thing I want to flag, because his home planet is Naboo. Naboo is the loveliest place in the galaxy. It's all lakes and rolling hills and buildings with domes on them, an aesthetic somewhere between northern Italy and a very expensive spa. It's the planet the films use whenever they want you to feel calm. If you were writing a villain from scratch, you'd give him somewhere volcanic, somewhere with a permanent thunderstorm, and a name that sounds like a cough. Lucas gave him a place where people go boating. I find that funnier and cleverer the longer I think about it. The most catastrophic figure in the story comes from the nicest address in it, and nobody ever remarks on this. There's no scene where someone says, "Isn't it strange that the Emperor is from the holiday planet?" It just sits there. Now, if you want to know who he was before any of the dark side business, you have to go into Legends, and I want to be upfront about that. Legends is the old, expanded universe, the vast library of novels and comics that were canon until Disney bought Lucasfilm and reset the board. Those stories still exist, they're still read, and a lot of them are excellent. They're just not official history anymore. So everything in the next few minutes is officially a story about Palpatine rather than the story of Palpatine, and I'll flag it when we cross back over. The book is called Darth Plagueis, written by James Luceno, again, published in 2012. It covers a span of a bit over 30 years leading up to the events of The Phantom Menace. And it gives you the young man on Naboo. He's 17. He's from a noble family, one of those old, moneyed, politically connected houses that every civilization seems to produce. And he is, by all accounts, already deeply unpleasant in ways his family can't quite name. There's power in him, and it hasn't got anywhere to go. Then a moon banker takes an interest. The moon is called Higo Damask, and he's a real financier with real holdings and genuine influence across the galaxy. He's also a Sith Lord, but we'll get to him properly later, because he deserves his own stretch of the evening. What matters right now is that he spots something in this teenager on a pretty planet, and he starts the long work of drawing it out. The Legends version of what happens next is fairly grim, and I'll keep it brief rather than dwell. Palpatine's initiation into the Sith involves killing his own family. Not in a duel, not in some grand tragic confrontation. He kills his family, and then years later goes to a Senate meeting. That's the origin story. Whether you accept it as history or as a very good novel, it establishes the thing that runs through everything else. There's no version of this man that was ever going to be fine. But here's what I actually find interesting about the Naboo years. And it isn't the murder, it's the double life. Because from that point forward, Sheev Palpatine has 2 full-time jobs, and he does both of them properly. He isn't a Sith Lord who's pretending to be a politician as cover. He's genuinely a politician. He does the committee work, he learns the procedure, he builds relationships with people who will still be defending him decades later. He goes on to represent Naboo in the Senate, and by all visible measures, he's good at it. And at the same time, he's the other thing, entirely, without ever letting the two touch. That's not a disguise. A disguise is a thing you put on. This is closer to 2 lives running in parallel, both of them real, neither one a performance in the way we usually mean. There's a philosophical puzzle that gets at this better than anything I could say directly, and it's about 2,500 years old. It's from Plato's Republic, and it's called the Ring of Gyges. The setup is simple. A shepherd finds a ring that makes him invisible. Nobody can see what he does. Nobody can hold him accountable. Within a very short time, he's seduced the queen, murdered the king, and taken the kingdom. The question Plato's putting to you through this story is uncomfortable. Is anyone actually good, or are we all just visible? Most of us, if we're honest, have a slightly nervous laugh about that one. The whole of moral philosophy since has been various people trying to give a satisfying answer, and the answers are decent, but none of them are knocked down. Palpatine is the Ring of Gyges with a Senate seat. He has the invisibility. Nobody can see the second life. And what he does with it is exactly what Plato's shepherd does, only slower and on a galactic scale. What makes him a character rather than a thought experiment is that he doesn't seem tormented by having 2 selves. There's no scene of him staring into a mirror wondering which one is real. Both are real. He's a man who genuinely enjoys committee work and also happens to believe that the strong should rule and the weak should be used, and those 2 facts coexist in him without friction. I think that's rarer than fiction usually allows. Most double-life characters crack. The strain of it is the story. Palpatine has no strain. He's the same person at the dinner party and in the dark, and the reason nobody catches him for decades isn't that he's a brilliant liar, it's that he's barely lying. There's a small detail I love from the actor's side of it, and I'll come back to this properly much later on, but it's worth planting now. When Ian McDiarmid was brought back for the prequels, Lucas described it to him as 2 roles: the public face, the kindly politician, and the true self underneath. 2 roles, 1 man, and the actor was told to play both fully, rather than let one leak into the other. So the young man from Naboo isn't a mask that gets discarded. He's half the machine. One more thing about the name before we move on, because it does something oddly useful. Sheev is silly. Sidious is theatrical, all hiss and menace, obviously chosen. Emperor is a title. But Sheev is what his mother called him, and the fact that it sounds like a name you'd shout across a car park is the whole point. The most consequential figure in the galaxy started out as somebody's son, on a nice planet, with an unremarkable name. Villains in stories usually come pre-monstered. They arrive with the voice and the scar and the reputation. This one arrived as a slightly odd young man from a good family, and everything after that was constructed. Which brings me to something that took me an embarrassingly long time to understand about him. He didn't invent any of this. Not the philosophy, not the method, not the long game. All of it was handed to him, fully formed by a tradition far older than him, with rules and a code and a very specific idea about how power passes from one person to the next. So let's talk about the rules. Imagine you're designing an organization and you have one requirement above all others. It has to survive for 1,000 years in secret while being actively hunted by a well-funded and highly competent enemy who thinks you're extinct. Have a think about how you'd structure that. Most people's instinct is to go big. Recruit widely, spread out, build redundancy, make sure that if one cell gets rolled up, the others carry on. That's how most underground movements have actually worked in our history, and it's a reasonable instinct. The answer the Sith arrived at is the opposite of that, and it's so counterintuitive that I think it's the single most interesting piece of design in Star Wars. 2 people, that's it. 1 master, 1 apprentice. Ever. And when the apprentice becomes strong enough, they kill the master and take an apprentice of their own. That's the rule of 2. It comes from a Sith Lord called Darth Bane, long before any of the films, and the summary of it that gets quoted is his own. 1 to embody the power, the other to crave it. Sit with that for a second, because it's doing more work than it looks like. The first half is obvious enough. A conspiracy of 2 is almost impossible to detect. There's no organization to infiltrate, no membership to leak, no building to raid. If you're the Jedi and you're looking for the Sith, you're not looking for an army. You're looking for 2 people in a galaxy of quadrillions, and you don't know what either of them looks like. Of course you conclude they're extinct. What else would you conclude? The second half is the part I keep turning over, because the succession plan is murder, on purpose, by design. Most organizations treat succession as their biggest structural weakness. It's the moment everything is up for grabs, and businesses, monarchies, football clubs, entire countries have come apart at exactly that point. Everyone knows this. It's why there are so many books about it. The whole discipline of talent pipelines and leadership development exists because handing power from one person to the next is a nightmare that nobody has satisfactorily solved. Bane's solution isn't to fix the problem, it's to schedule it. If the apprentice is strong enough to kill the master, the apprentice deserves the position, and the tradition gets stronger. If the apprentice tries and fails, they weren't strong enough, and the master finds another one. Either way, the line improves. It's a filter that runs automatically, forever, and it can't be gamed by flattery or seniority or any of the things that corrupt normal succession, because the test is simply whether you can actually do it. As a piece of engineering, it's horrible and it's elegant, and I have to admit a grudging respect for it. As an HR policy, it's obviously insane. I'd like to see the induction pack. Why did the Sith end up here? Because the previous approach was a catastrophe. For most of their history, the Sith weren't 2 people. They were an empire, at points an enormous one, with academies and fleets and thousands of dark side users. And they lost, repeatedly. Not primarily because the Jedi were better, but because the Sith kept destroying each other from the inside. That's the recurring pattern in every account of it. Their own self-interest turns them against one another. Alliances collapse the moment there's an advantage in collapsing them, and a war that should have been won gets thrown away over rank, which is a fairly damning thing for a philosophy to have on its record. The creed says, the strong should rule. Fine, but if everyone believes that and everyone thinks they're the strong one, you don't get rule. You get a knife fight in a lift. Bane's insight, and I think it genuinely is an insight, is that the flaw isn't fixable, so you should build around it. Reduce the population to 2, and the internal conflict has nowhere to spread. It becomes a single relationship rather than a civil war, contained, directional, and productive. The idea itself comes from Lucas. The dramatization of where it came from comes from Drew Karpyshyn, who wrote a trilogy of novels about Bane in the mid-2000s and gave the whole thing a face. Those books are legends now, same as the Plagueis novel, but the rule survived into current canon because it's load-bearing. Most Sith you see on screen are operating under it, and there's a line of Banes from those books that I think is the real philosophical centre of the Sith, more than the code we'll get to shortly. He says equality is a lie, a myth to keep the masses quiet, that it binds the strong to the weak and drags the exceptional down into mediocrity. That's not a fantasy argument. People have made that argument in earnest in our own history, and some of them have been taken seriously. What I notice about it is how much resentment is baked in. It isn't really a claim about greatness. It's a complaint about being held back. There's a sourness to it that keeps coming up whenever the Sith explain themselves, and I don't think that's accidental. Now, the Legends novel about Plagueis opens with the rule being carried out. Plagueis kills his own master. The master's name is Tenebrous, and the killing isn't a duel or a confrontation. It's an arranged accident that Plagueis engineers, and then finishes by hand, which is very much the tone of the whole tradition, incidentally. Almost nothing in the Sith is a fair fight. Fair fights are for people who care about being seen to win. And then there's a detail in that opening that I think about a lot. Immediately after killing his master, Plagueis tries to use the man's dying body for an experiment. He wants to see if he can catch something as it leaves. It doesn't work, but the attempt tells you everything about what he's actually interested in. And we'll come back to that in a while because it turns out to be the thread that runs through this entire story. So, generation after generation of this. Master, apprentice, murder, repeat. Each pair operating in total secrecy, each one inheriting everything the last one knew and adding to it. And it worked. That's the uncomfortable bit. The Jedi flatly believed the Sith were gone. Not as a rumour or a hope, as settled institutional facts. There's a moment in The Phantom Menace where the Jedi Council are confronted with hard evidence that a Sith Lord exists, and their reaction is closer to bewilderment than alarm. It's like being told about a dodo in the car park, which is roughly the gap between us and the Norman conquest, if you want it in earthly terms. Try to imagine a two-person conspiracy that started then, passed hand to hand through 30-odd generations, never wrote itself down anywhere findable, never grew, never got sloppy, and arrived intact in the present day with its objective unchanged. I don't entirely believe it, if I'm honest. It's a wonderful idea, but the human variables are doing a lot of work. Somebody in that chain has a bad decade. Somebody gets drunk and tells a stranger. Though I suppose that's rather the point of the murder clause. The ones who get drunk and tell a stranger don't make it to the next generation. What Palpatine inherits, then, is not a set of beliefs he worked out for himself. It's a going concern, an old firm with 2 employees, an unbroken strategy, and a very clear idea of what winning looks like. He didn't build any of it. He's the last man in a very long queue, and what he does with that inheritance is the thing that makes him worth the evening, because he's the first one in the entire line who actually finishes the job. But before the job, the creed. Since we're on the subject of what they believe, we should probably look at what they actually wrote down. Here's the text. It's short and I want to take it seriously as a piece of writing before we take it apart. Peace is a lie. There is only passion. Through passion, strength. Through strength, I gain power. Through power, I gain victory. Through victory, my chains are broken. That's the code of the Sith. 6 lines, a ladder, 1 rung at a time, ending in freedom. And before we go anywhere near the philosophy, I want to tell you where it came from, because it's my favourite piece of trivia in the whole of Star Wars, and it never fails to delight me. It was written by a video game writer. In 2003, there was a game called Knights of the Old Republic. One of its writers, David Guyder, was working on the section set on the Sith homeworld, and he needed something for the players to encounter. So he asked Lucasfilm a very reasonable question. What do the Sith actually believe? Is there a code like the Jedi have? And the answer, as far as I can tell, was essentially that there wasn't one yet. So he wrote it. That's it. The central creed of the dark side, the thing that gets quoted in essays and tattooed on people, and treated as ancient scripture within the fiction, was produced by a bloke who needed some text for a level. It didn't turn up in official Star Wars animation canon until years later, in an episode of the Clone Wars. I find that wonderful. The ancient Sith philosophy is younger than most of the people reciting it. Right, the content. The first thing to notice is that it's an inversion, deliberately, structurally, line by line. The Jedi Code begins by denying emotion in favour of peace. The Sith Code begins by denying peace in favour of passion. Same shape, opposite direction, like a photographic negative, which is a choice with consequences, and I'll come back to it. The second thing is that it's an argument, not a description. Most creeds tell you what the world is like. This one is trying to convince you of something, and the giveaway is the very first word. Peace is a lie. That's a rebuttal. You don't open with a rebuttal unless somebody's already said the opposite, and you're cross about it. So what's the actual claim? Roughly this. The calm that the Jedi hold up as the goal is a fiction, or worse, a sedative. Conflict is the permanent condition of things. Wanting is the engine that makes anything happen at all. Therefore, the correct response is not to smooth yourself down into serenity, but to take the wanting and use it. And the reward for doing that properly is that you stop being anyone's instrument. Put like that, it's not a stupid position. I want to be fair to it, because a lot of commentary on the Sith treats them as cartoon nastiness, and they're a bit more coherent than that. There's a real tradition in human thought that says the same thing in politer language. Comfort is stagnation. Struggle produces excellence. The domesticated animal is safe, and also nothing. Bane's expansion of it, the thing about equality being a myth that binds the strong to the weak, is that same argument stripped of its manners. Now, the philosophical family this belongs to is very old, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Go back to Plato's Republic, Book 1. Socrates is having a conversation about justice, and a man called Thrasymachus loses patience with the whole business and says something blunt. Justice, he says, is nothing more than the advantage of the stronger. The rules are made by whoever's in charge, for whoever's in charge, and then everyone else is taught to call obedience a virtue. That's the Sith Code with the poetry taken out. There's another one in a dialogue called the Gorgias, a character named Callicles, and he goes further. He argues that conventional morality is a con invented by the weak majority to restrain the naturally superior individual, that nature's own law is that the better should have more, and that a genuinely excellent man would throw off all of it and simply take what he's capable of taking. Callicles is Darth Bane in a toga. I'm not being cute about it. The arguments line up almost point for point. The detail I find quietly funny, and the reason I bring it up at all is this. Plato wrote both of them, deliberately, as opponents. They exist in those dialogues to be answered, and in the structure of the text they lose the argument. Thrasymachus tries to storm off but is stopped. Callicles goes sullen and stops engaging. They are, in the history of philosophy, the losing side of a conversation that happened once, was written down, and has been getting picked over for 2,500 years since. Nobody teaches a Thrasymachian ethics module. He's the setup, and the Sith have built an entire religion out of the setup. They're the only people I can think of who've taken the man who walked out in a huff and made him their prophet. I don't say that to be clever about it. I say it because it points at a real weakness in the position, which is that it's much better at attacking than at building. Thrasymachus is very good at pointing out that rules serve the powerful. He's got nothing whatsoever to say about what you should do on a Tuesday. The other name that gets dragged into this constantly is Nietzsche, And I want to deal with that briefly because I think it's a misread. And it's a misread that annoys me slightly. People see will to power and master morality and slave morality, and they think, right, Sith, fair enough on the surface. But Nietzsche's will to power isn't about ruling other people. It's much closer to a drive towards self-overcoming, toward becoming more fully what you're capable of being. And he's frequently contemptuous of people who need to dominate others, because needing anything from other people is precisely the weakness he's diagnosing. And the thing he's most hostile to across his entire body of work is resentment. That sour, backward-looking grievance that defines itself entirely against what it hates, which is, if you look at it honestly, the actual emotional engine of every Sith we ever meet. They're not creating values, they're getting even. So the Sith aren't Nietzschean. If anything, they're a very good illustration of the thing Nietzsche was complaining about, which is a slightly delicious irony that I don't think the films intend, but I'll take it. Now back to the inversion, because this is where the code has a structural problem that I think eventually kills it. If your entire creed is defined as the opposite of somebody else's creed, then you need them. Line by line, the Sith code only means anything in reference to the Jedi code. Peace is a lie is a response. Through passion, strength is a correction. The whole document is a reply to a letter, which makes the Sith parasitic on the thing they want to destroy. If they ever actually won completely, and the Jedi vanished from the galaxy and from memory, the Sith would be holding a piece of paper that argues against nothing. They'd have to become something. And I don't think they can, because there's nothing in the code that tells you what to do once the chains are broken. It ends at freedom. Freedom for what? To do what? With whom? For how long? Silence. That's the bit that gets me. It's a ladder with no landing. Anyway, that's the theory, and the theory is very much older than the man we're actually here for. What Palpatine does is take this creed, which is mostly a grievance in verse, and turn it into a method that actually functions. That's his contribution. He's not the greatest philosopher the Sith ever produced, and he's certainly not the most powerful. Whatever he'd tell you, he's the one who worked out the paperwork. The sound I keep coming back to is the applause. There's a shot near the end of Revenge of the Sith where the Senate chamber is full, and everyone is clapping. Thousands of representatives from thousands of worlds in a purpose-built room designed to make deliberation possible, and they're all applauding the end of the thing they were elected to protect. Padme says a line about liberty dying to thunderous applause, and it's the most quoted line in the prequels for good reason. Nobody is holding a gun. That's the whole point. Nobody in that room is under duress. Lucas has been extremely open about where this came from, and I think it's worth hearing in his own framing because it's the actual thesis of 6 films. He was writing the first Star Wars in the early 70s, Vietnam was ongoing, Nixon was running for a second term, and there was talk about extending beyond that. And Lucas said it got him thinking historically about how democracies turn into dictatorships. His answer, and this is the line that does all the work, they aren't overthrown, they're given away. There's an even better one from a story conference in 1981. When someone asked whether the Emperor was a Jedi, Lucas said no, he was a politician. Then he named Nixon directly, said the man subverted the Senate and took over, and added that he pretended to be a really nice guy. Now that's it. That's the character brief. 24 years before the film that dramatizes it. And the historical models Lucas has cited over the years are a fairly consistent set. Caesar and the Roman Republic, Napoleon after the French Revolution, Hitler and the Weimar Republic. 3 different centuries, 3 different cultures, 1 shape. Now there's a piece of political theory that describes that shape with unpleasant precision, and I'm going to walk through it slowly because it's the most useful lens on the whole prequel trilogy. It's called the state of exception, and it comes from a German jurist called Carl Schmitt, writing in the 1920s. Before I explain it, I need to tell you who Schmitt was, because it matters. He was a serious legal mind, formidably clever, widely read, and he later joined the Nazi Party and provided intellectual cover for it. He's not a neutral observer describing a danger from outside. He's describing a mechanism he approved of, from the inside, which is precisely why the description is so good. It's a manual, not a warning. The situation he was writing about was Weimar Germany. The Constitution had a clause, Article 48, which allowed the president to take emergency powers in a crisis. Perfectly sensible on its face. Every state needs some capacity to act fast when something terrible happens. The problem was that it never defined what a crisis was. And Schmidt's observation, which is the whole thing in one sentence, is this: whoever gets to decide that an emergency exists is the real sovereign, because that person sits both inside the law and outside it at the same time. Inside, because their authority comes from the Constitution. Outside, because the moment they declare the exception, the Constitution's ordinary rules stop applying, and they're the one deciding what happens instead. You don't need to break the law. You need to be the one who decides when it's paused. Now watch the prequels with that in your head. Episode 1. There's a crisis, a trade blockade of a peaceful planet, an ineffectual Senate that can't respond, and a compelling argument that the current Chancellor is too weak for the moment. A vote of no confidence goes through. Palpatine takes the office. He has been in the room for the entire manufactured crisis, publicly outraged about it. Episode 2. There's a bigger crisis. A separatist movement, an army being assembled, a galaxy that's frightened. The Senate needs to act and can't, because deliberative bodies are slow, which is a feature until it becomes a liability. So a proposal is made to grant the Chancellor emergency powers. And the detail I cannot get over every single time is who proposes it. Jar Jar Binks, the most mocked character in the franchise, standing up in the Senate, moving the amendment that ends the Republic. Whatever you think of the character, that is a genuinely magnificent piece of construction, because the death of a democracy doesn't come from a villain in a cloak. It comes from a sincere, slightly overwhelmed person who wants to be helpful and doesn't understand what's being asked. Palpatine's acceptance speech is a masterclass. He says he takes it with reluctance. He says he loves democracy. He says he'll lay the power down the moment the crisis passes. And then, with his very first act under the new authority, he creates an army. Every word of that is true, in the narrow sense, and all of it is a lie. Episode 3. The emergency powers, which have now been in place for 3 years of war, are used to dissolve the Senate entirely and place everything in the office of the executive. And the thing that makes it airtight is that by that point the Jedi have attempted to arrest him, which means he can present the whole thing as a coup attempt he survived. He isn't seizing power, he's defending the Republic from traitors. He gets to be the victim of the plot he wrote. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy and cheap to start pointing at current events, and that's not what tonight is for. What I'd rather point at is the structure, which is old and keeps recurring, and doesn't belong to any one country or decade. The Roman version is the one Lucas keeps mentioning, and it's instructive because Rome had a legal office of dictator. Genuinely, constitutionally. In an emergency, the Senate could appoint one man with absolute authority for a fixed term, 6 months, after which he stood down. And for centuries it worked because the people appointed to it kept standing down. The system depended entirely on the character of the men holding it. Then Sulla held it without the time limit. Then Caesar was appointed dictator for 10 years, then for life. The legal machinery never changed. The norm did. That's the thing about emergency powers that nobody likes hearing. The danger isn't the clause, it's that the clause is fine right up until it meets somebody who doesn't intend to give it back. And there's a follow-through in Star Wars that I think is the most quietly devastating detail in the whole franchise, and it's tucked away in a novel rather than a film. After the Empire falls, After Endor, after the Emperor's death, after the rebels have won and the New Republic is being assembled by exactly the people who fought hardest against tyranny. The first Chancellor of the New Republic keeps the emergency powers. They don't repeal them. The machinery Palpatine built stays on the books in the hands of the good guys, because it turns out that when you're trying to rebuild a galaxy from rubble, having the ability to act decisively is extremely convenient. That's not cynicism, by the way. I think it's just accurate. The tool doesn't care who's holding it. Which brings me to the thing I find genuinely uncomfortable about Palpatine as a political figure, and it's why I think he's a better villain than his reputation suggests. Every step is legal. There's no moment where he does something unconstitutional and gets away with it. The Senate votes, the amendment passes, the powers are granted, extended, and used within their stated scope. If you were a lawyer in that galaxy, following it in real time, you would struggle to identify the point at which anything improper occurred. The improper thing is the shape of the whole, and you can only see the shape from a distance, and by the time you're far enough away to see it, it's finished. I've heard people call the prequel politics boring. Fair enough, the pacing is what it is, and a trade dispute is not the most cinematic opening, but the substance of it is the single most serious thing Star Wars ever attempted, and it's the part that has aged the best. Anyway, that's the machinery. What I want to look at next is the machinery working on one person, at close range, in a single scene, because he does the entire thing in about 4 minutes, and it might be the best acting in the saga. The image first, because it's the thing I remember before any of the dialogue. There's a sphere of water suspended in the middle of a dark auditorium, and inside it figures are swimming. They rise and they sink, and they turn over each other in slow loops, going up, going down, going nowhere in particular. It's abstract, it's rather beautiful, and it's not doing anything narratively at all. It's just weather in the background. Except that what's happening in the seats is a young man being talked into destroying his own life, and the shape of the thing he's being talked into is a circle. I don't know how deliberate that is. With the prequels, it's hard to tell what's design and what's a happy accident of production, and I've read arguments both ways. But it sits there in the frame, and it works, so I'm inclined to give it the credit. Now, before the words, a structural observation that I only learned recently, and which improved the scene enormously for me. Anakin has 5 conversations with Palpatine across Revenge of the Sith, 5 spread through the film, and if you lay them out in order they form a mirror. The first one rhymes with the last one, the second rhymes with the fourth, and the third, the opera, sits alone in the middle with nothing to pair with, which means the exact centre of the pattern is the moment his trust in Palpatine overtakes his trust in the Jedi. Everything before it is approach, everything after it is descent. That is not accidental. That's somebody's storyboard, and it's the kind of quiet craft the prequels get very little credit for. Right, what he actually does, the scene opens with Palpatine giving Anakin information, not asking for anything, not requesting a favour, just passing along something he thinks Anakin ought to know, which happens to be that the Jedi Council have asked him to spy on the Chancellor. Which is true, it happened. Anakin is uncomfortable about it already. That's move 1, and it's the foundation of the whole thing. He rarely lies about the Jedi's specific actions. He doesn't have to. He just tells Anakin things that are accurate and lets them do their own work. Move 2 is the reframe. Anakin says the Jedi use their power for good, and Palpatine gives him the line that I think is the single most dangerous sentence in Star Wars. Good is a point of view. 5 words. And notice what it isn't. It isn't evil is fine, or morality is for the weak, or any of the things a lesser writer would have put in a villain's mouth. It's a piece of undergraduate relativism, the sort of thing that gets said in a seminar room by someone who's read half a book, and it is exactly calibrated for a frightened 20-something who's beginning to suspect his institution isn't as clean as it claims. He follows it immediately with a comparison that the Sith and the Jedi are alike in nearly every respect, including their appetite for power, which is a lovely bit of rhetorical work because Anakin has just been denied the rank of Master by a council who then asked him to spy on his friend. The claim lands on ground that's already been prepared, and not by Palpatine, by the Jedi themselves. Move 3 is the story. He asks whether Anakin has ever heard the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise. Anakin hasn't, and Palpatine says, "I thought not. It isn't a story the Jedi would tell you." That is the entire seduction in a single sentence, and I want to give it its due. He's not offering power, he's offering the feeling of being let in. There's a body of knowledge you've been kept from by people who claim to be teaching you everything, and I'm the one who'll tell you. Every conspiracy, every cult, every bad relationship with an older mentor runs on that exact move. It works because it's flattering, and because it's often partly true. And then he tells the story, a Sith Lord so powerful and so wise that he could influence midi-chlorians to create life, and whose knowledge of the dark side was such that he could keep the people he cared about from dying. Anakin, whose wife is in the film's opening act carrying a child, and whose dreams have been telling him she's going to die, is now fully in the room. Palpatine finishes with a line about the dark side being a pathway to abilities that some would consider unnatural, which is doing something specific. He's preempting the objection. Yes, it's unnatural. Some people would say that. Say it in a certain tone of voice. And unnatural stops sounding like a warning and starts sounding like a category error made by small minds. The whole exchange takes about 4 minutes. He never once asks for anything. That's what makes it good. Anakin does all of the wanting. Palpatine supplies information, a frame and a story, and then sits back in the dark and watches a man persuade himself. Now there's a genuinely open question underneath the scene, and I want to be honest, that it doesn't have an answer. Is the story true? Lucas's original intent, as far as it's been reported, was that it isn't. That Palpatine is dangling a flattering Sith myth in front of a desperate young man, and that Plagueis' powers are exaggerated or invented outright to make the bait attractive. Read it that way, and the scene is a con artist doing a con, and the tragedy is that Anakin buys a fake, but everything published since has confirmed enough of it. Later material establishes the midi-chlorian research as real. Essence transfer turns out to be a real technique. The abilities described in that opera box have been progressively upgraded from myth to documented fact by 20 years of subsequent storytelling. So we've ended up in a strange position. The author intended a lie. His successors made it substantially true. And both readings are now sitting in the text at the same time, and there's no version of Star Wars where you can cleanly pick one. I don't want to resolve that, and I don't think it needs resolving. I find it more interesting unresolved. It means the scene works whether you're watching a man being deceived or a man being told the truth by someone who happens to be evil. And those are two quite different films, occupying the same 4 minutes. Here's the small detail I'd add though, and it's the one that tips me slightly. Earlier in that same film, Anakin executes a defenseless man. Count Dooku, disarmed, on his knees, no threat to anybody. Palpatine tells him to do it, and he does. And immediately afterwards, he says it wasn't the Jedi way, and he shouldn't have. And Palpatine's response is not a justification, it's a permission. He says it's only natural, the man cut off your arm. Of course you wanted revenge. Notice the direction of that. He isn't arguing that the killing was right. He's telling Anakin that his own reaction was normal, and that the guilt is the thing that's out of place. He's not corrupting the man's morality. He's just gently detaching him from it, one small absolution at a time, and letting the natural drift do the rest. By the time they get to the opera, the work is mostly done. The story about Plagueis isn't the moment of the fall, it's the receipt. there's a version of this character that would have been enormously less interesting, where he stalks about being obviously sinister, and everyone can see it but nobody can stop him. That's most cinematic villainy. What we got instead is a man who spends 3 films being genuinely helpful to a young person who has nobody else in his corner, and who is, in every scene, the only adult in the story who takes Anakin's feelings seriously. That's the horrible part. He's a better friend than the Jedi are. Not a good one, but a better one. That's the sales pitch, and it's an extraordinary piece of work. What he was actually buying with all of it is smaller and stranger than galactic domination, and it's been sitting in that opera box the whole time. He wanted to not die. That's it. That's the whole objective. Everything else, the Republic, the war, the Empire, the 2 Death Stars, the millions of people, the entire apparatus of galactic tyranny, is scaffolding around one man's fear of his own ending. I want to sit with that for a while, because I think it's the most human thing about him, and also the most pathetic, and both of those at once is unusual for a villain. Start with where it came from, because he didn't invent this either. He inherited it, the same way he inherited the rule and the code. His master, a Moon Sith Lord known as Darth Plagueis, was obsessed with immortality. And what I find fascinating is the specific flavour of the obsession, because it isn't mystical. He believed the secret was scientific, not a ritual, not a bargain with something ancient, but a research problem, biology, essentially, with the Force as an instrument rather than a religion. His approach was to work on midi-chlorians. Those are the microscopic organisms in the Star Wars universe that connect living things to the Force, introduced in The Phantom Menace to a reception I'd politely describe as mixed. And he wasn't merely trying to boost his own connection, he was trying to influence them directly, to make life, to hold a body open against the thing that closes it. There's a lovely and slightly awful detail in the Legends account of his early attempts, which is that Plagueis tried it first on the corpse of the master he'd just killed. Within minutes, he had the body, it was warm, and he wanted to see if he could catch something on its way out. He couldn't. But you learn everything about a person from what they do in the first 10 minutes after achieving their life's ambition. And what this man did was start the next experiment. Now the double life again, and this is where the Legends novel earns its reputation. Publicly, he was Higo Damask, head of a major financial house. And the crucial thing is that it wasn't a cover story. He was genuinely one of the most consequential financiers in the galaxy. Real holdings, real influence, real work. The same meetings that moved enormous sums of money also moved legislation and ambassadors, and occasionally assassinations, and none of that was a front for the other. It was all one operation. He also had a strategic view that separates him from every Sith who came before. He thought conquest through violence was crude and slow, and that the galaxy could be taken through political and economic means instead. Buy the infrastructure, own the debt, let the wars happen on your terms and finance both sides, which, if you think about it, is where his apprentice's entire career comes from. The Senate's strategy isn't Palpatine's innovation. It's his master's thesis, executed by a better politician. And then there's the swing that the Legends novel takes, which is either brilliant or a disaster, depending on who you ask. In that version, the experiments work slightly too well, and the Force pushes back. It responds to being interfered with by producing a correction. And the correction is Anakin Skywalker. That's the Legends explanation for the virgin birth business in The Phantom Menace. Not a miracle exactly. A galactic immune response. I go back and forth on it. Some days it feels like an elegant fix for the single strangest plot point in the prequels. It gives it a cause, it ties the trilogy's mysticism back to its villain, and it makes the whole saga a story about a man who accidentally created his own executioner. Other days it feels like the sort of thing that happens when a franchise can't leave a mystery alone. Either way, it's not canon anymore. but it's a hell of an idea, and I'd rather have heard it than not. Now forward 40 years of filmmaking, because the payoff to all of this arrives in a very strange place. In Return of the Jedi, the Emperor falls down a reactor shaft, and that's supposed to be that. Vader throws him, there's a flash, the Empire ends, everyone dances with the Ewoks. For 36 years that was the ending. Then the Rise of Skywalker turns up and he's back. And the film's own explanation is essentially a shrug. He says he has died before, and repeats the line about the dark side, offering abilities others call unnatural. Which is a callback rather than an answer. The actual answer is in the novelization written by Ray Carson, and it is a considerably better piece of writing than the film gave it room to be. He'd been planning it for years. He could sense that Vader would eventually turn on him, and rather than prevent it, he prepared for it. There was a body being grown, in secret, on a hidden world, waiting, and as he fell, before his body reached the bottom of the shaft, he pushed his consciousness out of it and across the galaxy. That technique is called essence transfer, and the detail that closes the circle is that he learned it from his master. The man who spent his life trying to defeat death did, in a sense, manage it. Just not for himself. It did not go smoothly. The body wasn't ready. His followers hadn't finished. So the greatest Sith Lord the Order ever produced arrives in a vessel that can't hold him, and spends decades trapped inside a failing clone, kept going by machinery. There's a moment in the novelization where he simply stops breathing, and someone has to replace a part and administer a syringe to start him again. That's what winning looks like. A man in a tank on a dead world, being maintained like plumbing, and they kept trying. His followers spent years splicing genes and growing alternatives, hoping one of them would be viable enough to house what they called their God consciousness. Most of them failed. One of the attempts, according to later material, was the creature that ended up running the First Order in the sequel films. A made thing, grown as a spare body, that got a personality by accident and a job by default. There's something almost farcical about it if you stand far enough back. The Immortality Project produced a warehouse of failed drafts. Right, let's do the philosophy, because there's an obvious counter-argument, and it's about as old as writing. The oldest surviving story we have, more or less, is Gilgamesh. A king, the strongest man alive, watches his friend die, and is so undone by it that he goes to the ends of the earth looking for the secret of eternal life. He never finds it, and then he loses it on the way home, to a snake, while he's having a bath. He goes back to his city, and the poem ends with him looking at its walls. 4,000 years ago, somebody worked out that the search doesn't end well and wrote it down, and we've been telling versions of it ever since. Then there's Epicurus, and his argument is the sharp one. He says death is nothing to us. Where death is, we are not. Where we are, death is not. There's never a moment at which you and your own death are in the same room having a bad time. The suffering is entirely in the anticipation, which means the fear is a tax you pay in advance on an event you will never experience. Lucretius, who came later and wrote it up in verse, adds the symmetry point. You weren't distressed about the enormous stretch of time before you existed. Why should the equivalent stretch afterwards be different? The two are the same kind of nothing, and you've already comfortably survived one of them. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that reading Epicurus makes anyone unafraid of dying. It doesn't work like that, and I'd be lying. But it does something quite useful, which is to point out that the fear is doing far more damage than the thing it's about. And that's the case against Palpatine that I find most persuasive, more than any of the moral arguments. He conquered a galaxy while frightened. Every day of it, the Senate, the war, the Jedi, the fleets, the throne room, all of it built by a man who couldn't be at peace in a single afternoon of it, because the whole point was to buy more afternoons. He never enjoyed anything. That's what strikes me. There's not one moment in 6 films where he takes pleasure in something for its own sake. He takes pleasure in outcomes, in other people's mistakes, In the moment, a plan lands. But he never eats a good meal, or watches the sun go down, or listens to the opera he's sitting in. He's in the opera house, and he doesn't watch the opera. He watches Anakin, the most powerful man alive, and his interior life is a queue of tasks between him and a deadline he can't move, which is all very cosmic and grand from up here. Down at ground level, in the empire he actually built, it looked completely different, and it looked considerably more boring. The rule of two says there are two, master and apprentice, no more, no less, and we went through why the number is what it is. Palpatine, over the course of his career, has something like 5. That's not me being loose with the count. Depending on how you define the relationship, and how much of the Clone Wars you're counting, he trains or handles Maul, Dooku, Vader, Ventress at one remove, and by the sequel era, he's producing bodies in vats. The man who inherited the strictest succession rule in the galaxy treated it like a rough guideline, and I think the way he handles each of them tells you more about his actual philosophy than any speech he gives. Start with Maul. Maul is the first one we meet, and he's the most straightforwardly terrifying thing in The Phantom Menace. Horns, red and black, double-bladed lightsaber, about 3 lines of dialogue, and a fight sequence that people still rate as the best in the saga. He is a weapon, and he was made that way deliberately. Taken as a child, trained in pain, kept isolated, given no life outside the function. Then he's cut in half and dropped down a shaft. And Palpatine, as far as we can tell, doesn't think about him again for a decade. The Clone Wars brings him back, which was a controversial choice at the time, and which I've come round on entirely, because what it lets the story do is show what Palpatine does with an obsolete asset. Maul survives. Maul rebuilds himself. Maul builds a criminal empire out of nothing through sheer refusal to stop existing. And when he finally gets back in front of his old master, expecting some kind of reckoning, what he gets instead is a demonstration. Palpatine beats him effortlessly and doesn't kill him. That's the cruel bit. He keeps him alive because a living Maul is still occasionally useful, and a dead Maul is nothing. There's no rage in it, no settling of scores, it's asset management. Then Dooku. Dooku is the interesting one to me, because he isn't a weapon. He's a former Jedi Master, an aristocrat, genuinely learned, and he came to the dark side through disillusionment rather than hunger. He watched an institution he'd given his life to become slow and compromised and complicit, and he decided the whole thing needed pulling down. Which is the most sympathetic route to villainy the saga offers, incidentally. He isn't wrong about the Republic. He's right about nearly all of it. He's simply wrong about who he's working for. And Dooku spends the entire Clone Wars believing he's the apprentice, the successor, the one who'll be there at the end. He runs the separatist movement. He manages the war. He takes the blame for all of it in public, while his master takes the credit for opposing it. And then in the first 10 minutes of Revenge of the Sith, at the moment of his greatest usefulness, Palpatine tells a 22-year-old to kill him, and the 22-year-old does. There's a beautiful detail in the novelization of that film where Dooku, moments before, is so pleased with how the plan is going that he's tempted to wink at Palpatine. He thinks they're in on it together. He is, at that instant, the most confident he's ever been. He was never the apprentice. He was the seat warmer. The whole point of Dooku was to be a plausible Sith Lord in the meantime, and to be there, disarmed and kneeling, when Anakin needed his first murder. That's what I mean about the philosophy showing itself in the handling. The code says that through passion, I gain strength, and through strength, I gain power. Fine, but watch how it operates in practice, and you notice something. Nobody is ever strong enough to stop being material. Dooku was formidable. Maul was formidable. It made no difference at all because the category of person who is used and the category of person who uses aren't determined by strength. They're determined by who got there first, which rather undermines the whole creed if you think about it. It isn't a meritocracy of power. is just a man at the top of a ladder kicking down. And then Vader. Vader's the one everybody focuses on, and the relationship is different from the others, but not in a warmer direction. What Palpatine does with Anakin is not recruitment, it's construction. 20-odd years of patient friendship, most of it apparently sincere, aimed at producing a person with no remaining attachments and no institution to return to. And the moment it completes, on the lava, the thing that emerges is significantly less useful than the thing that went in. That's the joke at the centre of it, and I don't think the films get enough credit for how bleak it is. The most feared enforcer in galactic history is, by the Emperor's own reckoning, a disappointment. Anakin at full strength would have been extraordinary. What Palpatine ends up with is a man in a suit who can't breathe properly and needs a medical bay to take his helmet off. He kept him anyway, partly because he's still enormously dangerous, and partly, I suspect, because a broken apprentice can't do to you what you did to your own master. That's the pattern once you see it. He never wanted a successor. The rule of two requires you to raise the person who'll eventually kill you, and Palpatine spent his entire career carefully ensuring that no such person would ever exist. Maul was a weapon, not a student. Dooku was a placeholder. Vader was deliberately damaged, and by the end he'd given up on people altogether and moved on to growing bodies. He broke the rule that made the Sith work, and he broke it out of the exact flaw the rule was invented to contain. 30 generations, and it held. Then it met a man who was better at it than anyone had ever been, and he turned out to be precisely the person it couldn't survive. There's one more relationship in this vein worth a mention, and it's a small one. Asajj Ventress, Dooku's own apprentice, trained in secret because Dooku was doing to Palpatine exactly what Palpatine was doing to Plagueis. And when Palpatine found out, he simply ordered Dooku to kill her. Everyone in this tradition is running the same play on the person above them. Many of them are hiding an apprentice. All of them are planning the same murder. It's less a philosophy than a very slow-moving pile-up. Anyway, speaking of long games, there's one that ran underneath all of it for over a decade, and almost nobody in the story noticed a thing. Let's talk about the clones, because this is the part of the plan that I think is the most impressive, and it barely gets discussed as philosophy at all. Here's the situation Palpatine needs to engineer. He needs a war. He needs the Republic to have an army, which it constitutionally doesn't. He needs that army to be absolutely loyal to him personally rather than to the Senate. And he needs it to be capable of killing every Jedi in the galaxy simultaneously, on command, without warning. That's a fairly demanding brief. The solution is set up roughly a decade before anybody notices, and the mechanics of it are lovely. An army is commissioned in secret from a species of cloners on a remote ocean world. It's ordered in the name of a Jedi Master, who is conveniently dead by the time anyone asks. The records of the planet's existence are quietly deleted from the Jedi archives, so that when someone eventually goes looking, the map has a hole in it, exactly where the answer is. Then it just sits there, for 10 years, growing. And the payoff arrives at the perfect moment. The Republic discovers a threat it can't meet, and in the same week discovers that an enormous army has mysteriously already been prepared for it. Nobody looks too closely at that coincidence because they need the army. That's the thing about a well-timed gift. Gratitude and scrutiny don't easily occupy the same room, but the part I find genuinely chilling is what's inside the soldiers. In the canon version, established through the Clone Wars, every clone is grown with a control chip in their head. It's presented as a safety measure, something to make them less prone to the unpredictability of ordinary soldiers. What it actually contains is a command. The clones fight alongside the Jedi for 3 years. They serve under them, they take orders from them, they die for them. There are friendships in there. There are clones who name themselves after their generals' habits, who paint their armor, who mourn. The show spends 100-odd episodes making you love these men, which was a strange creative decision until you realize what it's for. And then a phrase is spoken over a comm, and every one of them turns around and shoots the person they've been protecting. Order 66. What makes that a philosophical act rather than merely a tactical one is the choice of instrument. Palpatine could have used droids. He had access to entire droid armies. He was running the other side of the war, after all. Droids would have done the job with no chips and no complications. He used people. Specifically, he used the people the Jedi trusted most. I think that's the clearest single statement of what he actually believes. Loyalty, in his view, isn't a real thing. It's a chemical process that can be interrupted. Friendship is a configuration, and configurations can be edited. The Jedi's fatal error wasn't strategic, it was ontological. They thought the men beside them were their friends, and Palpatine's entire position is that there's no such category, only arrangements that haven't been altered yet. And he's not just asserting that, he builds a working demonstration of it and runs it in front of the whole galaxy. There's something else in the design worth noticing, which is that Order 66 wasn't presented as a coup. It was one item in a long list of contingency orders, all of them mundane, all of them sitting in the same manual. Order 65 covers removing a Chancellor who's become unfit. Order 66 covers Jedi who've turned on the Republic. They're numbered, filed, and legally defensible. That's the same move as the emergency powers in a different domain. Don't break the rules, write them. Put the atrocity on page 66 of a document nobody reads, years in advance, in the same font as everything else. The other thing I keep thinking about is how long he had to wait. 10 years for the army. 3 more years of running both sides of a war, personally, in 2 identities, in a role that involved daily public scrutiny. Decades before that in the Senate. From the legend's account of his recruitment as a teenager to the moment he declares an empire is the better part of a working lifetime. 30 years of nobody finding out. I genuinely cannot get my head round the patience of it. Most people can't keep a birthday surprise for a fortnight. And there's no evidence he ever came close to giving it away. No near misses that we see, no moments of visible strain. He goes to the meetings. He does the work. He is throughout extremely good at a job he intends to destroy. Which raises a question I don't have a satisfying answer to, and I'll just put it out there rather than pretend. What was it like being him? Not dramatic is my guess. That's the thing about a plan that long. It can't be sustained on excitement, because excitement doesn't last that long. It has to become ordinary. Most of the Emperor's life must have been committee meetings and travel and correspondence and waiting, punctuated very occasionally by something happening. The vast majority of the greatest conspiracy in galactic history was admin. And I suspect that's why he never quite reads as tortured. There's no room for torment in a schedule like that. He's not a man consumed by dark passions. He's a man with a very long to-do list who happens to have a second job that nobody knows about. And he's been doing both for so long that neither one feels like anything much. There's a specific quality to that kind of patience that I find more unnerving than any amount of shouting. It means he was never in a hurry. Anything he couldn't get this decade, he'd get next decade. Anyone who was in the way would eventually retire or die or be replaced by someone more useful, and he'd still be there. Time was on his side, and he knew it, and that knowledge is audible in every scene he's in. He never raises his voice until the very end, and by then he's already won. Which is a good moment to come down off the throne entirely, actually, and ask what any of this was like for people who weren't in the room. A form. That's what I want to start with. Somewhere in the Empire, on a moon nobody's heard of, there is a form. It has boxes on it. Somebody designed it, somebody approved the design, and somebody spends their working life processing them at a rate that is monitored. That's the Empire. Not the throne room, the form. Because there's a gap here that I find more interesting than anything in the throne room, and the films mostly skip over it. Upstairs you've got an ancient, mystical tradition, ancient codes, the manipulation of the fundamental energy field of the universe, immortality research. Downstairs you've got shift rosters. The two have almost nothing to do with each other. There's a detail in the canon novel about Grand Moff Tarkin that I found slightly startling when I came across it, which is that Palpatine, as Emperor, isn't especially interested in running the Empire. He's focused on the Force. He's studying, pursuing, working on the personal project. The actual administration, the sectors, the fleets, the budgets, the governors, gets handed off to subordinates. He wanted the galaxy. He didn't particularly want to govern it. And that makes complete sense once you notice that governing was never the goal. The Empire isn't the achievement. It's the security arrangement around the achievement. He needed absolute power so that nobody could interfere with what he was actually doing, which was trying to solve his own mortality in private, which means the entire Imperial apparatus, all of it, every stormtrooper and star destroyer and orbital shipyard, is essentially a very large fence around a man's research. Now, the way it was administered has its own grim logic, and it's usually called the Tarkin Doctrine. The idea is straightforward. You cannot physically occupy a galaxy. There are too many worlds and not enough soldiers, and there never will be enough soldiers. So you don't rule through force. You rule through fear of force. You demonstrate once at a scale that makes the point permanently. And after that, the demonstration does the work that an occupying army would otherwise have to do. That's what the Death Star is for. It's not primarily a weapon, it's an argument, and its function is to be believed rather than used. I want to point out how neatly that follows from the creed we looked at earlier. If your foundational belief is that the strong should rule and the weak are material, then the most efficient possible government is one where the weak simply agree in advance that resistance is not survivable. You don't need consent. You don't even need obedience exactly. You need the arithmetic to be obvious. It's a philosophy that produces as its logical endpoint a bureaucracy with a bomb. And that combination is the thing modern Star Wars has got so right. And it's the reason the Empire has become genuinely frightening again for a lot of people, rather than just fun. Because when you actually look at how it operates day to day, it isn't cackling villainy. It's a career. There are people in that machine who are ambitious middle managers. There are people chasing a promotion, worried about a performance review, keen to impress a superior who's visiting from the capital. There are people who took the job because it was stable and the alternative was a farm. There are people who are quite good at their work and take a professional pride in it, and whose work happens to be the administration of an occupation. Almost nobody in the Empire believes in the Sith code. Most of them have never heard of it. They aren't dark side ideologues. They're employees, and the regime doesn't need them to be anything else. Hannah Arendt wrote about this in the early 60s and got herself into an enormous amount of trouble for it. And I'll keep it brief, because it's a heavier subject than tonight calls for. Her observation, watching a real trial of a real administrator of atrocity, was that the man in the box was not a monster in any of the ways people had expected. He was mediocre. He was a functionary who was good at logistics and interested in his own advancement. And the horror wasn't his depravity, it was his ordinariness. That's what a mature tyranny actually looks like from the inside. Not everyone gripped by an evil idea. A very small number of people gripped by an idea, and an enormous number of people just doing a job within the structure. That idea created, and once the structure exists, it more or less runs itself. It doesn't need the belief anymore. That's the point of building a structure. There's a small callback I want to make here, and then leave alone, because we did it properly earlier. Remember that the emergency powers survived the Emperor. The people who won kept the machinery. That's the same principle from the other direction. Structures outlive the reasons they were built. I think this is why the Empire works so well as fiction, and it took me a long time to articulate why. It's not that it's a metaphor for any particular regime, it's that it correctly identifies the relationship between a bad idea and the enormous quantity of ordinary competence required to execute it. One man believed something monstrous. Millions of people filed the paperwork, and the ones who filed the paperwork were, in the main, not monsters. They had families and hobbies and mild grievances about the catering. Some of them were probably lovely. That's the uncomfortable bit, and it's much more uncomfortable than a room full of fanatics would be, because a room full of fanatics is at least a thing you can identify from across the street. There's a moment in some of the newer material where a character says something to the effect that the Empire is so big and so slow that it can't notice small things, and that this is the crack in it, which I like because it's true of every large organisation any of us has ever dealt with. The thing that makes an empire able to swallow a galaxy is the same thing that makes it unable to see what's happening in a shed. Anyway, that's the view from the bottom of the tower, and it's the part of the story I find myself thinking about most, weeks after a rewatch. But I want to go somewhere completely different now, because none of this works. The philosophy, the politics, the patience, the quiet menace, without one particular Scottish stage actor, who got the job largely because of his nose, starting a theatre in London at the beginning of the 80s. There's a play on by Sam Shepard called Seduced, and in it, an actor is playing Howard Hughes as a very old man, the reclusive, deteriorating, late-period Hughes, all fingernails and paranoia. The actor doing it is in his mid-30s. In the audience, or at some point across that run, is a casting director named Mary Selway. She's working on the third Star Wars film. She's looking for someone to play the Emperor, and she's got a problem, because the character is meant to be about 120, and the actor originally cast has had to withdraw. She sees a man in his 30s convincingly playing extreme old age at close range, night after night, and she makes a note. What happens next is my favourite casting story in cinema. MacDiarmid goes in to meet George Lucas and the director, Richard Marquand. The meeting lasts about 10 minutes, and by his own account, the film is barely mentioned. They talk about life. George Lucas talks very briefly about how nice his nose is. Then he gets the part. I love that beyond all reason. The most consequential villain in modern film, cast on the strength of a nose and a pleasant chat. There's a practical logic underneath it, mind. What they needed was someone who could hold up under an extreme close-up while buried in prosthetics, and an actually elderly actor might not have survived the schedule. Ian MacDiarmid was 37 at the time, 7 years older than Mark Hamill, and this is the detail that always stops me, 2 years younger than Harrison Ford. The Emperor is younger than Han Solo. He's been younger than Han Solo the whole time. The makeup was designed by Nick Dudman, and it took 4 hours to put on and 2 hours to take off. 6 hours of the working day before you've done any acting. Latex, layered, needing time to set between stages. And MacDiarmid has said something about that which I find revealing. He liked the anonymity. Under 4 hours of prosthetics, with his voice dropped considerably lower than his own, nobody knew what he looked like or sounded like. He could go back to the theatre afterwards and be nobody in particular. He also didn't imitate the previous version. Because there was a previous version, in The Empire Strikes Back, the Emperor appears very briefly as a hologram, played physically by an actress called Marjorie Eaton under heavy makeup, and voiced by Clive Revill. That's a genuinely strange piece of trivia, and it's true. The Emperor's first appearance is a composite of two people, neither of whom is the man we now think of as the Emperor. MacDiarmid built the voice himself, from scratch, working from what the makeup told him about the creature underneath it. He's described looking at that face and understanding that whatever this thing was, it was very old and not entirely human anymore. Then 16 years of nothing. As far as he knew, that was that. There had been rumours during Return of the Jedi that Lucas had a much larger story in his head, but McDiarmid assumed that if it ever happened, they'd cast someone considerably younger to play the earlier version. Why wouldn't they? Instead, the maths did him an enormous favour. By the time The Phantom Menace was shooting, he was in his 50s, which is precisely right for a middle-aged senator, played with no prosthetics at all. Just a man in nice robes, being unfailingly polite to everyone, which meant he ended up doing something almost nobody in film gets to do. He played a character across nearly 40 years of his own life, in the wrong order, and the ages lined up. And the brief for the prequels, which I mentioned much earlier, was that it was 2 roles. Not one character with a secret. 2 played fully. You can see him doing exactly that if you watch for it. The senator isn't a sinister man doing a bad impression of a kind one. He's actually kind on screen in the moment. The warmth is real warmth, which is the only way the whole thing works, because if you can see the villain underneath, then every other character in the film is an idiot, and suddenly you're watching a story about a galaxy of fools. McDiarmid has been fairly candid about the psychology of it too. His framing is that the kindness is a mask over calculation, and that the manipulation was always the enjoyable part to play, which you can hear. There's a lightness in those scenes that isn't menace at all, it's pleasure. A man extremely good at something, doing it. 2 more things I like about him. The first is that he had no idea until Revenge of the Sith that Palpatine could fight. He'd played the character for 2 decades as a man of pure political and mystical power, and then someone handed him a lightsaber. He's spoken about being surprised to find the character was good with it, and immediately given full credit for that to his stunt double, which is a lovely and very theatre actor thing to do. The second is that he's from Carnoustie, on the east coast of Scotland, and has spent most of his working life in the theatre. He's run a theatre, he's done an enormous amount of Shakespeare. The voice that the entire galaxy is frightened of belongs to a man whose day job for 50 years has mostly been standing on a stage in front of a few hundred people. And I think that's actually why the performance works, rather than an amusing aside. The prequels are frequently criticised for their dialogue, and some of that criticism is fair, but dialogue like that is written to be spoken in a register that most film acting has abandoned. It's declarative, it's formal, it's closer to a stage play than to naturalism. Most of the cast were trying to make it sound like people talking. McDiarmid wasn't. He was performing it out to the back of the house. He's the only person in those films entirely at home in them. There's a version of Star Wars where the Emperor is a growl in a suit and nothing more, and I don't think anyone would have written essays about it or spent 2 hours picking over his philosophy. What makes him worth the attention is that somebody turned up and played him as a person with an interior life, an appetite, and a sense of humour, which is a good place to turn actually, because for all the craft and all the patience and all the planning, the philosophy doesn't work. It never worked, and it fails for reasons that were built into it from the beginning. You can't really assess a philosophy in isolation, and the Sith Code is especially hard to assess that way, because as we established, it's a reply, so it's worth spending a while with the thing it's replying to, and being honest about the fact that the Jedi don't come out of this as well as they'd like. Their position, stripped down, is that attachment is the problem. Not love, they'd insist. Compassion is fine. Compassion is arguably the whole job. What's forbidden is possession, the particular love that says this person is mine, and I cannot bear to lose them, because that's the love that will make you do terrible things when losing them becomes a possibility. And they're right. Demonstrably, in the text, they are completely right. The entire saga is a case study proving their point. A man who cannot accept the loss of his wife burns down a civilization to try to prevent it. The trouble is that being right about the diagnosis doesn't make you right about the treatment, and by the time we meet them, the Jedi have turned a piece of hard-won spiritual insight into an institutional rule enforced on children. which is where I start to go off them, if I'm honest. Because that's the bit that gets me. They take infants, they raise them in a temple, away from their families, on the grounds that a child who never knew their parents won't form the attachments that cause the problem, which is a solution of sorts. It's also a policy that would raise eyebrows in any other context and which the films present entirely without comment. And then there's the war, which is the part I find hardest to forgive. By the time of the Clone Wars, the Jedi are generals, peacekeepers running an army, commanding troops, fighting a conflict on behalf of a government that is visibly corrupt and which they privately have doubts about. They know it's wrong for them. There are conversations about it in the show, quite a lot of them, and they do it anyway, because stepping back seemed worse. That's the vulnerability Palpatine actually exploits, and it's got nothing to do with the dark side. It's the ordinary institutional failure of an organisation that has drifted from what it's for, knows it, and can't find the moment to stop, which is why the opera scene lands the way it does. When he tells Anakin that the Jedi are just as interested in power as the Sith, that isn't a lie that requires belief. It's a slightly unfair reading of something Anakin can already see out of the window. I want to be fair to them though, because it's easy to be glib about the Jedi, and I don't think they're the villains of the story. Their doctrine has a genuine philosophical pedigree, and it's not stupid. The rejection of attachment is more or less the Buddhist position, and the Stoic one arrives at something adjacent by a different road. The claim isn't that you shouldn't care, it's that the grasping quality of caring, the need for the thing to stay exactly as it is forever, is what turns love into suffering, and that you can love something properly while holding it loosely enough that its ending doesn't destroy you. That's a real teaching, and people have organised entire lives around it, successfully. Where the Jedi go wrong, I think, is that they turned a practice into a prohibition. A practice is something you work at badly, over decades with failures. A prohibition is a rule that produces liars, because the people who can't manage it simply hide it, which is precisely what Anakin does. He gets married in secret and carries it for 3 years with no one to talk to about the most important thing in his life, and the only adult who ever invites him to talk about anything is the Chancellor. So you end up with two doctrines facing each other, and the symmetry between them is genuinely elegant. The Sith say, passion is strength, take what you want, hold it as tightly as you can. That produces a man who will destroy the galaxy rather than lose one person. The Jedi say, hold on to nothing, do not cling to desire, let it all pass through you. That produces an order so afraid of feeling that it can't notice a young man drowning 6 feet away. Both of them are avoiding the same difficulty from opposite directions, and the difficulty is just that loving people is dangerous, and there isn't a technique that makes it safe. Two ancient orders, thousands of years of accumulated wisdom between them, and neither one has anything useful to say about the single most common problem in anybody's life. I find that quite funny, and also a bit sad. The films, to their considerable credit, don't resolve this cleanly. The answer that eventually works isn't Jedi doctrine, and it certainly isn't Sith doctrine. It's a young man in the last act of the original trilogy refusing to give up on his father, which is an attachment unambiguously the exact kind the Council had spent its entire existence warning about, and it's the only thing in 9 films that actually defeats the Emperor. I'll come back to that in a moment, because it's the hinge of the whole argument. But it's worth noticing that both orders are wrong in the story on their own terms, and the thing that wins is a person acting outside both of them on an instinct that neither could account for. One last observation before we move on, and it's about the codes themselves, rather than the people. Both documents are short. Both are 5 or 6 lines. Both are structured as ladders leading up to a promise. One ends with the Force freeing you. The other ends with there being the Force. Same length, same shape, opposite content. That symmetry is a bit too neat for a universe, and I suspect it tells us something true about both organisations, which is that they've each reduced an enormous and difficult body of experience down to something you can recite, which is what institutions do. Something works, it gets written down, the writing gets memorized, and eventually people are reciting the summary of a thing nobody in the room has actually done. The Sith and the Jedi have both been living off compressed wisdom for a very long time, and when the crisis finally arrives, neither of the recitations is any use at all. Since we're on the subject of what gets compressed and simplified, let's talk about his face for a bit. Because it's carrying a lot of the argument that the dialogue doesn't have to. The design is genuinely unusual for a villain. He isn't imposing. He isn't scarred in the heroic way. He isn't armoured. He isn't large. He's a small, hunched, hooded figure with a face like something left in water. Whatever he is, he stopped being a well-looking man some time ago, and the eyes are yellow. That yellow is doing an enormous amount of work across the whole saga, because it's the visual grammar for the dark side, and it's consistent. It shows up on Anakin after he turns, when he's slaughtering the separatist leaders on Mustafar. It shows up on other characters when they're slipping. It's the one piece of Star Wars iconography that says, without a word, that this person has gone past a point. There's a production detail attached to that which I enjoy enormously. The eyes were considered essential, non-negotiable, part of the character, and in the early 80s achieving them meant hard glass contact lenses, which were exactly as uncomfortable as they sound. By McDiarmid's own account, the tests for those lenses were rather unpleasant, and they may have been a factor in why the role became available in the first place. The most famous eyes in villainy exist because somebody agreed to put glass in his. Now the transformation, because this is one of those bits of Star Wars that people argue about pleasantly and at length, and there isn't a settled answer. In Revenge of the Sith, during the fight in his office, Palpatine goes from looking like a slightly tired senior politician to looking like the thing we met in the original trilogy. It happens across a couple of minutes in the middle of the scene, and the film doesn't explain it. The most common reading is that his own lightning is reflected back at him and disfigures him. That's what appears to happen on screen, and it's the straightforward interpretation. The other reading, which I prefer and which various bits of supporting material lean towards, is that the lightning doesn't damage him at all. It burns off a concealment he'd been maintaining for decades. What you're seeing isn't an injury. It's what he's actually looked like underneath for a very long time. The accumulated cost of the dark side, held behind an illusion because a man with that face cannot be elected to anything. I like that version because it makes the whole thing a moment of exposure rather than a moment of harm. He isn't wounded in that scene, he's revealed, and he immediately weaponizes the revelation by presenting himself to the Senate as a victim of Jedi assassins, deformed in the line of duty. He wears the face like a campaign poster. That's the part that gets me. Within about a day of losing his disguise, he's built a political strategy out of the new one. And it's a good strategy, irritatingly. A visibly damaged leader is a sympathetic one. You can't look at him and think he's enjoying this. Whatever else he is, he's a man who has clearly paid something, and people extend a lot of credit to anyone who looks like they've paid something. There's a small costume detail that goes with it, which is that after that scene he's almost never seen without the hood up. Partly practical, partly the same instinct that made him keep the ruined face rather than repair it. The hood does two jobs at once. It hides him, and it makes you lean in to look. And leaning in to look at someone is halfway to deferring to them. I've always thought the robes are underrated as characterization, actually. Everyone else in the Empire is in a uniform with rank insignia and polished boots, all of it announcing exactly where they sit in a hierarchy. He's in a plain dark garment with no markings at all, no medals, no braid, nothing to indicate office, which is the flex, obviously. Insignia is for people whose authority needs explaining. There's a version of that idea that's much older than Star Wars, obviously. The portrait in the attic, the face that records what the life has actually been, rather than what it's looked like from outside. And it's a satisfying piece of moral bookkeeping in fiction because it almost never happens in reality. People mostly go through their lives looking like whatever they look like, regardless of conduct. Star Wars has the dark side do the accounting visibly. Everything you take, it takes something back, and it takes it out of your face, which is, when you think about it, a strange thing to have in a philosophy of pure self-interest. The Sith code promises that power breaks your chains. What it doesn't mention is that the process is subtractive, and that everyone who's ever completed it has ended up looking like something you'd find under a rock. Not one of them stayed handsome. That's a fairly poor advertisement, and I'm surprised it doesn't come up more often in recruitment. And here's a fun detail that I think about far more often than is reasonable. John Williams wrote a theme for the Emperor. It turns up properly in Return of the Jedi, and it's usually called the Emperor's theme, a slow, chanting, low choral thing built out of a repeating figure that sits somewhere between a funeral and a ritual. It sounds like something being summoned rather than someone arriving. It's one of the few pieces in the saga with a proper choir on it, and the choir is singing nothing in particular. That's deliberate. There's no language, no text, just voices doing something ecclesiastical in a mode that refuses to resolve. At the end of The Phantom Menace, there's a celebration. The blockade is broken, the planet is saved, everybody's happy, and there's a parade with a band playing. That piece of music is called Augie's Great Municipal Band, and it's properly jolly. Brass, bright, festive, entirely appropriate for a scene of children throwing flowers. It is the Emperor's theme, same melody, transposed into a major key, dressed up in celebration. The tune that will eventually score the death of the Republic is playing over the party at the end of the first film, and everyone in the frame is dancing to it. I don't think there's a better piece of foreshadowing anywhere in the 6 films. It's not a visual clue or a line of dialogue you can go back and catch. It's the actual celebration music. The audience is being told what's coming in the one moment they're least likely to be listening for it. And it works on you even if you don't consciously notice, which is the whole point of film scoring. Williams has said versions of this many times, that music is doing its job when the audience feels it rather than hears it. The other thing I like about it is what it implies about the man himself. The parade at the end of that film is, in the story, a moment of victory for everyone except him. His planet's crisis has been resolved. The invasion has been repelled. The young queen has won. Except, of course, he engineered the entire crisis to get himself elected Chancellor, and the parade is quite literally his coronation with an extra step. So the score is correct. That's his music, because it's his victory. Everybody dancing has misread the situation, and the orchestra knows. There's a wider point about the Star Wars music that's worth a small tangent while we're here, because it's part of why the whole thing works, as well as it does. Williams built the score on leitmotifs, which is a technique out of 19th century opera. Wagner is the usual reference. You give each character or idea a musical phrase, and then you develop, combine, invert, and corrupt those phrases as the story moves, which means the score is carrying information continuously. When 2 themes overlap, that's a statement. When a theme appears in a minor key, that's a statement. When a hero's theme decays into a villain's theme, over 8 bars, you've been told something the dialogue hasn't said. It's a very old technique, and Star Wars is probably its most successful modern application. And it means the Emperor is present in the films considerably more often than he's on screen, because that low chanting figure keeps surfacing underneath scenes he isn't in. He's in the room musically for about 20 years before he takes the throne. There's one more thing about that theme that I like, and it's about what it isn't. It isn't frightening in the way film villain music usually is. There's no sting, no stabbing strings, none of the vocabulary that horror scores use to make you tense. It's slow, and it's low, and it's almost liturgical, and the effect is less alarm than dread, which are genuinely different feelings. Alarm is fast and it passes. Dread just sits there. That's the right choice for him, because he isn't a jump scare. Nothing about this man is sudden. A theme that spiked would be describing a different character entirely. And the choral element is doing something specific too. Voices, in film scoring, tend to mean the sacred. That's the association, going back through centuries of church music. And composers use it because the shorthand is already installed in the audience. Putting a choir under the emperor makes him a religious event rather than a political one, which is accurate when you think about it. He isn't a general, and he isn't really a president. He's the head of a mystery religion that happens to have acquired a navy, which is a rather nice image to sit with, actually. The most patient man in the galaxy, waiting in the orchestra. So that's the craft of him. I've been putting off the conclusion for a while now because it's the part where the whole thing falls over. One more small thing before the conclusion, and it's about words rather than deeds. Sidious, that's the Sith name he takes, and it's not subtle. It's insidious with the letters knocked about, and it means exactly what it looks like it means. Something working underneath, quietly, in a way you don't notice until the damage is done. Which is characteristic of the naming across the whole tradition. Plagueis is plague, bane is bane, maul is maul. Tenebrous is darkness, more or less, straight out of the Latin. There's a Sith Lord called Vectivus, and one called Millennial, and one called Ruin. And once you start listing them, it becomes clear that nobody in this organisation has ever chosen a name that wasn't a mission statement. I find this very funny, and I think it's underrated as a piece of characterisation. Because think about what it means practically. At some point, each of these people sat down and picked. There was a moment where a man decided that from now on he would be called Plague. Presumably, he considered alternatives. Presumably, some of them were worse. It's such a specific kind of vanity. These are people who believe they've seen through the comforting illusions that bind ordinary minds, and their response is to give themselves a stage name that describes how frightening they intend to be. The word Darth itself has a slightly murky origin, and Lucas has given more than one account of it over the years. The most commonly repeated explanation is that it's a compression of Dark and Death, and there's a version where it began as a surname before it became a title. Whether it was ever quite that deliberate is hard to establish now. Early Star Wars drafts were rewritten so many times that a lot of the etymology has gone soft. What's clear is that at some point it stopped being a name and became a rank. You're given it. It replaces what you were called before entirely, and everyone in the tradition uses it in preference to the original. Which is the point, obviously. The name is the severance. Anakin becomes Vader in the same breath that he stops having a wife and a master and a life, and the new name is the receipt for the transaction. Renaming as a marker of transformation is everywhere in our own history, and mostly in contexts that have nothing to do with villainy. Monastic orders do it, a new name at ordination, at conversion, at the taking of vows. The old self is set down, and a new one is issued, and the name is the visible part of a change that's meant to be total. The Sith have taken that and inverted it, which is entirely on brand for an order that we established earlier, defines itself by inversion. Same ritual, same function, opposite direction. You give up your name, not to enter a life of service, but to leave one behind. There's a small linguistic thing I enjoy here as well. Every Sith name is a noun, or near enough. Plague, bane, ruin. Many Sith pick an adjective. Nobody is Darth considerate. They're all things rather than qualities, which suggests a group of people who'd rather be an event than a person. And they're all in a language that nobody in the story speaks. These are Latin and English roots, turning up in a galaxy far away, which is a bit of production convenience rather than in-world logic, but it does produce a nice accidental effect. The names sound old to us. They're supposed to sound old to them as well. And the last thing I'll say about the names loops, back to where we started, Palpatine never lost his old name. He kept it. He was Sheev Palpatine of Naboo before, during, and after, and there's no scene where anyone calls him Sidious in public. He wasn't severed from anything, because he never had a life that needed severing. He was operating both identities in parallel from the beginning, and the Sith name was an accessory rather than a replacement. Everyone else in that tradition gave something up to be there. He didn't give up a thing. He simply added a second job to a life that was already going quite well, and then worked both of them until there was nothing left to work for. I think that's the loneliest fact about him, and it's the one that finally makes him a bit sad to me, rather than only frightening. Vader lost something and knew it. Dooku lost something and told himself it was principle. Maul had it taken from him before he could know what it was. Palpatine never lost anything, because there was never anything there to lose, which brings us at last to the part where it comes apart. He loses twice, and both times to the same thing, and I don't think that's a coincidence. Let's do the structural failure first, because it's the tidiest. The rule of two produced 1,000 years of unbroken success, and then met the most capable practitioner in its history, and he broke it. Not by accident, by being exactly the person the code says you should be. We went through this with the apprentices, so I won't relitigate it. And so, at the end, there's nobody. The line stops. Whatever the Sith were, whatever they'd accumulated across 30 generations, it goes into a tank on a dead planet with a decaying body in it. And that's the end of the tradition. The philosophy killed the succession plan that made the philosophy viable. It's an autoimmune disorder. Then there's the thing he actually needed and couldn't produce. Late on, in the sequel era, there's a concept called a dyad. Two people bonded in the Force so completely that they function as one thing. And the material around it makes clear that this is something the Sith had spent an enormous amount of time trying to manufacture. He tried it with Anakin. His own master had apparently tried it with him. All of it a pale imitation of something older that they wanted and couldn't build. And when a real one finally appears, it forms between two people naturally, without anyone engineering it, for reasons the story never fully explains, which is the whole failure in miniature. The most important thing in his metaphysics is the one thing that cannot be arranged, coerced, purchased, or grown in a vat. It happens between people, or it doesn't. Now the personal failure, which is the one everybody remembers, the throne room, Return of the Jedi, Palpatine is torturing Luke, and Vader is standing beside him watching, and the calculation Palpatine has made is one he's made successfully for decades. Vader is a possession. Vader is damaged and dependent, and has nowhere else to go. The arithmetic is obvious, and it's wrong, because the thing standing next to him isn't a possession, it's a father. What I find so satisfying about that scene is that the code executes perfectly. It just executes on the wrong target. Passion is strength, absolutely. Through passion, strength. Through strength, power. Vader does exactly what the Sith code prescribes, using precisely the mechanism the Sith code identifies, and the passion in question happens to be love for his son. Palpatine isn't defeated by the light side beating the dark side in a straight fight. He's defeated by his own philosophy working correctly in a direction he didn't anticipate, because his philosophy has no category for the thing that motivated it. That's not a plot hole. That's the argument. There's a passage in the novelization of Revenge of the Sith that says this better than the film manages, and better than I'm going to. Matthew Stover wrote that book, and it's a good novel in its own right, not just a good tie-in. He has these sections about the dark, written almost as prose poetry, threaded through the chapters. The dark is generous, and it is patient. It seeds cruelty into justice. It drips contempt into compassion. It poisons love with grains of doubt, and it can afford to be patient because it only takes the smallest amount of rain for those seeds to come up. That's the best description of what Palpatine actually does that anyone has written. He doesn't create anything. He introduces a doubt into something that already exists and then waits. And Stover's counter to it, which arrives at the end of the same passage, is the line the whole saga rests on. The dark always wins, but one candle is enough to hold it back. I'd normally find that a bit much. In context, it isn't, because the book has spent 400 pages earning it. There's another line from that novel that I keep returning to, this one from Padme, talking about what Palpatine has been doing to the Republic. She says he carves away pieces of their freedom and bandages the wounds with small scraps of security, and then she looks out at the capital and asks how secure it actually looks. That's the political failure stated plainly, and it's connected to the personal one. The trade he offered the galaxy was safety for liberty, and the galaxy took it thunderously with applause. And what they got was 2 decades of an empire that was less safe than the flawed, slow, irritating Republic had been, because the thing generating the danger was the same thing selling the protection. So he fails at every level of the argument. Structurally, his creed can't sustain a succession. Metaphysically, the connection he needed can't be manufactured. Politically, his promise didn't deliver, even on its own terms. And personally, he was beaten by a bond that his philosophy insists doesn't exist. Here's the thing I want to say plainly, and it's why I've spent this long on it at all. The reason his philosophy fails is not that it's wicked. Wickedness is a moral judgment, and it's easy to make, and it doesn't tell you much. It fails because it's inaccurate. It's a description of how people work that leaves out the largest single fact about how people work, which is that they will do enormous, irrational, self-destructive things for people they love. He knew that fact, incidentally. He used it constantly. It's the lever he pulls on Anakin twice, decades apart. He understood the mechanism perfectly, and he still, somehow, didn't believe it was real. He thought it was a weakness in other people, a handle to grab, rather than a description of what people fundamentally are. That's the blind spot, and it's the same blind spot as the Immortality Project. Both of them are a refusal to accept the terms. He wouldn't accept that he would die, and he wouldn't accept that people love each other. And those are the 2 facts that end him. Everything else, the patience, the intelligence, the planning, the flawless political execution, was in service of a model of the world that was missing a piece. He was very good at being right about almost everything, which is a much more dangerous condition than being wrong about most things, because nobody catches it until the end. So we're back to a man in a chair. That's where we started, and it's where I keep ending up whenever I think about him. Everybody else in Star Wars is in motion. He sits and talks and is patient, and eventually the galaxy arrives at his feet without him having to go and get it. And the reason it works, the thing I said at the start and have been circling ever since, is that he told everyone. He said it in the Senate, in front of thousands of representatives. On the record, he said it to Anakin in an opera house, more or less directly. He said it to Luke in the throne room, at length, with the fleet arranged outside as a visual aid. There is no point in this story where his intentions are hidden from anyone who's paying attention. What protected him wasn't secrecy. It was that the truth was too large and too plain to be believed by people who were busy and frightened and reasonable. That's the bit I find genuinely unsettling, more than any of the lightning or the fleets. A conspiracy that whispers can be uncovered. A conspiracy that announces itself is safe, because announcing it looks like the one thing a conspiracy would never do. And it lasted 2 decades on that basis, which is longer than most governments manage while telling the truth. I don't want to draw a moral out of it. It's a cartoon villain in a space opera, and I've been fond of him since I was small, in the way you can be fond of something that would obviously kill you. But I do think there's something worth carrying away from all of this, and it isn't a warning about politics or a lesson about power. It's just a small, slightly consoling observation that the whole enormous thing, the war, the empire, the philosophy, the whole inherited weight of it, came apart because a man in a mask remembered he had a son. That's not a satisfying strategic outcome. It's not clever. It couldn't have been planned, and it wasn't earned by anyone's doctrine. It just happened, because that's what people are actually like underneath the codes they recite. There's a fair bit I didn't get to. Plagueis could carry a whole video by himself. A Sith Lord trying to solve death on a research budget is strange enough to deserve one. The Jedi Code could stand being taken apart on its own terms, instead of as the other half of somebody else's argument. And Tarkin, who I've mentioned twice in passing, might be the most unsettling person in the entire saga, precisely because there's nothing mystical about him whatsoever. He's just extremely good at his job. Some other time, maybe. So, Sheev Palpatine of Naboo, a man from the prettiest planet in the galaxy, who inherited a rule and then broke it, recited a code he hadn't written, and carried a fear he never once put down. Patient for a lifetime. And as far as I can tell, he never enjoyed a single afternoon of it. He sat in an opera house and watched a young man instead of watching the opera. I don't think I'll ever quite get over that. And that, more or less, is the philosophy of Palpatine. Thanks for staying up with it. Sleep well.